The following podcast by Fusion Family Wealth, LLC, Fusion, is intended for general information purposes only. No portion of the podcast serves as the receipt of or as a substitute for personalized investment advice from Fusion or any other investment professional of your choosing. Please see additional important disclosure at the end of this podcast. A copy of Fusion's current written disclosure brochure discussing our advisory services and fees is available upon request or at www.fusionfamilywealth.com.
Welcome to the Crazy Wealthy Podcast with your host, Jonathan Blau. Whether you're just starting out or are an experienced investor, join Jonathan as he seeks to illuminate and demystify the complexities of making consistently rational financial decisions under conditions of uncertainty. He'll chat with professionals from the advice world, entrepreneurs, executives, and more to share fresh perspectives on making sound decisions that maximize your wealth. And now, here's your host.
Hello, everybody. This is Jonathan Blau coming to you with another episode of the Crazy Wealthy Podcast. Thanks for joining us today. I have a very special guest who is someone who is near and dear to me. It's my father-in-law, and his name is Fred Gold. Fred was a partner for many years at Arthur Andersen, who was both in charge of the Long Island, what was called Enterprise Group, Middle Markets Practice, and also he was a divisional head. So we're going to talk about his money story, his history, some of the things he experienced professionally and personally that may have influenced his outlook as he succeeded and had some disappointments, as we all do through life. And with that, I want to introduce Fred Gold. Fred, Dad, welcome to the Crazy Wealthy Podcast.
Thank you, John. Pleasure to be here. Looking forward to it.
Thank you. So when you joined Arthur Andersen, which was one of the, back then, I guess, one of the big six accounting firms, there were six of them, or were there more when you joined?
This was circa 1969. And
Okay.
at the time, the big firms were called the Big Eight, which evolved later on to the Big Six and ultimately to the Big Four.
I think they call it now the Final Four.
The final could be. That could be.
All right, so when you joined Andersen, I joined my second year of life.
Long time ago, for sure.
Yeah. And so tell me how the job opportunity came about. I think you went to school, the University of Bridgeport.
Went to the University of Bridgeport, studied accounting, and when I graduated, at the time, it was 1967, and our country was in a tremendous buildup of the Vietnam War, and most fellas coming out of college was subject to the draft. There was a draft in place. And ultimately, 4 months out of college, I was drafted in the Army, and I spent the next 2 years in the Army. And when I came out, I started interviewing with some of the Big Eight accounting firms, but in particular, my father, who owned a gas station in Whitestone, Queens, had customers he was pretty close to, one of which was with Arthur Andersen for about a 3 or 4 year period at the time. And my dad mentioned to him, my son's returning from Vietnam. He's looking for a job. He's got a degree in accounting, University of Bridgeport. Do you want to give him a shot? And one thing led to the other, and I got an interview, and I guess I did okay. And I started with Andersen in October of 1969 and enjoyed a 31-year career there, and learned an awful lot about people and money and accounting, obviously. But, that's a thumbnail sketch of how I got to Andersen.
No, that's a great story. So I know, having the good fortune of having you as my father-in-law and knowing you for so many years, I know a lot of the internal stories that followed your career. And a couple of things I was always impressed with is no matter who I ran into as I was building my career, also on Long Island, whenever they learned about our relationships, oh, Fred Gold, what a great guy, or he was my mentor and he was just always so good to me, or the clients, one guy said, oh yeah, he was what I used to call him the gold standard, as my accountant. So those things were always very, very impressive and impactful to me. And I always tried to kind of guide myself and my behavior to hope people would think of me the same way. I know during your career toward you were 57, I think, and Andersen had an early retirement program where they required people to retire. And and I know you part of the retirement benefit that you were entitled to was a lump sum payment based on your best earning years or something like that. And I remember you calling me one day. I was a young advisor at 29, I think, or so at Sanford Bernstein, or somewhere in that age range. Mm-hmm. And even though I didn't have a lot of experience, we respected each other enough that you asked my opinion as to whether or not you should make the choice of leaving the retirement benefit for about 10 years as an unsecured creditor of the firm, meaning that you're at risk if they would go out of business of losing the entire thing. But the benefit is you wouldn't have to pay the tax on that money if you had chosen to take it right away. And then they would pay you a percentage of that money for the 10 years. And at the end of the 10 years, you'd get the lump sum and then pay the tax. You will deferred that tax for the whole time. And one of the things I remember discussing is today, I maybe didn't term it the same way, but I tell people who have that decision tree to address is try to make that decision one where there's big potential benefits of going one way with the decision, but there's also big potential detriments of going that way. So if you leave that money all in for the 10 years, you can't change that decision. And then something goes wrong, you lose your whole retirement potentially at some point. But if you didn't, if you left it all in, you would defer that tax for 10 years. So whenever I see a decision tree like that, where the future, by definition, the one characteristic about the future is that there's no facts about it, that we try to make that decision in a way to minimize regret. So my advice was something like, why don't you take half of the money now and leave half of it as an unsecured creditor. But to your, this happens as a human nature kind of response, is something called familiarity bias. And when we are familiar with a company or an entity that we're looking to invest in or associate with, we feel like we'll be helped more and hurt less by associating with things that we're familiar with than that we're unfamiliar with. And so that familiarity bias leads us to be blinded by things like over-concentration, whether it's in a particular investment. We put all our money in one company because we work for it and we think we know it, and therefore we're not going to lose because we say, yeah, this company is going to always do well. I know it. I've worked here for 30 years. Tell me how that relates to, in your mind, the decision that you made that unfortunately didn't have a good outcome for you, but to leave that money in the firm at 57.
Yeah, that's interesting. There was a couple of factors. Well, one was that at age 56, Arthur Andersen encouraged partners to take an early retirement benefit, which was a sizable amount of money, and they gave you the option of taking it all. Of course, if you did, you'd have to pay tax on it, or leaving it in and receiving, I think at the time, a 9% interest factor. So over a 10-year period, that sum of money would grow substantially. And I sat at that point in time looking back at history, knowing here's a firm with 85,000 people worldwide, with over 2,000 partners, with a history of, I don't know, about 80 years at the time. Never in my wildest dreams did I think a firm would wind up having to close its doors because of a lawsuit and government action. And so I felt I was pretty secure. Looking back now on it, I guess maybe taking half and deferring half would have been a much better answer. But, like in life, you do what you think is right at the time. You have certain biases. You have certain comfort levels. I felt very secure that Andersen would be around for another, not only 10 years, but for a much longer time than that.
Yeah, and by the way, your decision and that bias is not uncommon. It's more common than not. Most people make those decisions motivated or influenced by familiarity bias. And
exactly. And the other factor is I knew a lot of partners who had retired and had taken this benefit, and I talked to quite a few of them about their decision, and almost to a man, they said you shouldn't give up a 9% return on a firm that's financially stable and is going to be around a long, long time. And that drove my decision that, I guess it's a comfort zone that other people.
That's what, look, if someone had phrased it to you or offered you something different, saying, hey, Mr. Gold, you can either take this lump sum and pay tax on it, or you can leave it for 10 years with XYZ company that you've never worked for as an unsecured creditor, meaning if something happens to them, you're going to lose your money. I mean, the odds of you saying yes to whatever XYZ company was is probably slim to none.
Right.
Right. Yet with the challenges we have with familiarity bias is extrapolation, which is a big destroyer of wealth in investing in other ways. We look at a pattern because our minds are attracted to patterns. So your pattern was a number of them. Look, I've worked at the company for over 3 decades, and that pattern of growth and success and stability, I'm going to extrapolate that as a future predictable pattern, where there is no future predictable pattern based on a past pattern of any kind, because there are no facts about the future. But I'm also going to talk to the partners who have retired in the past, and they've been getting their checks like clockwork every month, and everything's great. And I'm going to extrapolate that into the future as a future predictable pattern. And so that's what familiarity bias and recency bias does. We look at recent patterns, could be 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, recent in a lifetime, and we extrapolate into the future predictable patterns. So I just draw that out for the audience as one of the lessons, hoping that they can take away from the story that we're talking about. And the other one is what I call regret aversion bias, where long-term regret is one of the most painful emotions because long-term regret never goes away. And when we make a decision that causes us to regret it, oftentimes what will happen is people will revert to status quo bias. So in other words, if I made a bad investment in the late 90s, I bought all technology stocks and they blew up on me, in order to avoid that potential outcome and that regret that I still feel today of having thrown away that money in the 90s, I'm just going to leave status quo bias, leave my money in cash. If I leave it the way it is, that can never happen. Do you find that the experience you had from a regret aversion standpoint has led you to react that way as a result of what happened, or not?
I have not. I mean, I felt that there was such a slim possibility of this happening, and okay, it happened, but as many things in life, you try to evaluate the risk, and now that I'm in retirement, I'm doing more trading of stocks, and I evaluate risk, and I do put in certain stop loss triggers to minimize my loss. I wouldn't want to, make an investment and lose 50% of it.
You would have done that anyway without that experience, I think.
Yeah, probably, but this really enhanced it.
You're more sensitive to it.
More sensitive to it.
So I get it.
But it didn't impact the experience of what we're talking about didn't impact me to the degree where any savings I'm automatically going to put into cash, or treasury bills or something. No.
Which is good, right? And one of the things I always admired about you is your temperament. In other words, you faced what I call, for most people, a catastrophic financial loss, and I've known you your whole life after that, right? Post that loss, and all I've seen is someone who's enjoyed life. You found a way to build a different career as a CFO of a company out here on Long Island, which you congratulations to you. Retired, I think, a year ago and enjoying retirement, deservedly so. But your temperament in many ways. So when you were a senior partner at the firm, from a standpoint of of success, as we all measure it in our country, as it relates to work, is you achieved a lot of success. And that never really tainted you from my perspective, where you never judged other people who might not have achieved the same success. You weren't really influenced by envy and greed and even fear in certain cases. You just always had an even temperament. So what I want to learn is, what do you think are some of the key reasons that you were able to approach such a catastrophic loss in such a way where to this day you still enjoy life and you got through it really with
right.
flying colors?
I'm going to answer that in two directions. One, if you're fortunate in life to have a good teacher, and I'm referring to my dad, he was my teacher. He taught me that do unto others as they would do unto you. Treat people with respect, and always be careful about what you're doing, and do the right thing, and always tell the truth, and be honest. All the basic principles that I guess take stress out of your life, because there's nothing you're hiding or nothing you got to cover up. And so he was, and by his example of working hard and focusing on his family, I learned a lot. I learned that, you've always got to make a decent living. You can work as hard as you have to work. You've got to do it, and you do it, and you take care of your family. The second big factor, I guess, in my life that shaped my behavior is, I mentioned earlier, I spent a year in Vietnam. I was in combat, and I got very close with fellas who came from very different socioeconomic backgrounds. Socioeconomic backgrounds. And I really learned that it's not how much money a person has. It's what's in his character, if you can depend on them, if they're honest, and you try to draw all the good qualities that other people bring to the table, try to incorporate it in yourself. And it was a learning experience. And when I joined Arthur Andersen, I was fortunate to have excellent people working and teaching me and guiding me. And as I moved up, I wanted to do the same things for people who worked for me. And that's why mentoring people became at the top of my list. You get out of people what you put into people. And particularly in the business I was in, public accounting, the trust factor, clients, you tried to do the best thing you could for clients. You had to care. You had to teach your staff to behave the same way you were and think the same way you were. And, all that really shaped me over my 31-year career with Arthur Andersen.
Yeah, and learning that from you, because there's people here listening to my first podcast introducing the episode. I lost my dad when I was 13. He was paralyzed when I was 11, and my mom was sort of an absentee mom. And one of the nicest things is when I went with you and Amy to Aruba early on in our relationship, and we used to walk on the beach. And I grew up in a society where it seemed like any time you were getting serious with someone you might marry, particularly if you were the male in the relationship, the parents of the female would say, "So what does your dad do? What does your family do? And how much? Where do you come from?" And I didn't have the most obviously desired answers to those questions, and you never made any judgments. You always accepted me and respected me and tried to teach me and so forth. So that went a long way. But I do remember one story that I'll interject that was funny. You might not remember it, but I remember because I joined Arthur Andersen. For the audience, I coincidentally, when I was getting my master's in tax and MBA in accounting, I had 5 offers from then the big 6 firms, and I chose Andersen. And I met Amy after I made that choice, but you were a partner there. And I was going into the tax department. You were in audit. And I remember we used to go to Long Beach on the weekends. And there was one weekend, and you talked to me in the garage on the way back from the beach. And when we got back, and you said, we may have a little problem because, Andersen has very strict nepotism, and they're talking to me about our relationship. And and there may be an issue. And I don't know if you remember how I responded to that. You probably
Um,
don't.
I probably don't. Yeah.
What I said is, I completely understand that there may be an issue with us working together. If I were you, I'd start to sharpen up your resume.
Now I remember that, and I think I laughed pretty hard. Yeah, exactly.
But
No,
it all worked. It all worked out. We agreed not to talk about it and so forth. But I remember that story. And one of the other things that I always talk about with you is how you go through life again without envy, without, material things weren't always that important to you. I don't think that you achieved success materially because you look to. I think you achieved success materially the same way I think I do. I love my clients. I learned that from you. I learned that from Andersen. We treat everybody like family, our employees, our clients, and then it just happens, right? You put in the
sure.
hard work and you have the right approach, and it just all works out. But what's interesting is one of the things I talk about, and I will talk about on the podcast, relating to happiness and money, is internal versus external benchmarks. So one of the examples I give is if I'm going away with my family on a vacation and we want to have a family of four enjoy our space and have a couple of separate rooms so we can be comfortable, I might go to the Marriott Hotel and get a suite. Because I'm not interested in telling people I stayed at a Four Seasons. I'm appealing to my internal benchmark, what's important to me. So many of us in our society, unfortunately, always appeal to the external benchmark. They rather stay in a one bedroom at the Four Seasons so they can say externally, "Hey, look, I took my family away for the holiday, stayed at the Four Seasons," even though they would have been better off staying in a Marriott in a more comfortable room. And so
Exactly.
I saw live your life in that regard. And another related analogy I like to use is eulogy versus resume virtues. So many of us in our society spend our life pursuing what I call resume virtues. We want a bigger house so we can say we want to donate money and get our name on the building. We want to become a CEO or a president and so forth so we can say that. And then when you go to someone's funeral, what you really want to hear about is how wonderful a person they were to their family and their communities, and how charitable they were. So we spend our whole lives pursuing these resume virtues when really what we want is the eulogy virtues. And I think it's related to the whole internal versus external bias situation, and I think, or benchmark situation. So if you could talk about that a little bit in terms of how. Why are you able to have such a great temperament outlook, and not why don't you worry about those things? You don't seem to care too much about what other people have. You live your life for absolute happiness, the internal benchmark, and no one really teaches you that, or maybe lessons from your dad and so forth. But there was one other story I want you to share. So when I said you don't judge people, related to this, you told me a story about your dad who worked in the garage. He was a mechanic. He had a greasy suit at the end of each day. Tell me about that story that influenced you, and why you don't judge people that way.
Yeah, it was interesting. My father, he learned to become an auto mechanic, and at 21 years of age, him and his best friend bought a service station, and he became somewhat of an entrepreneur that way. And he obviously served in World War II for 4 years. But as time went on, he became successful. And he always watched his money, but he created a balance between, saving some money, but spending some money, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And he gave his family everything we needed without being, overboard on spending. But when we moved out of Brooklyn to East Meadow, and this was about 1954, and I was 10 years old at the time. My mother had to learn how to drive, so she did, and she got her license, and it was time for my dad to buy her a new car. So one night after work, he picked her up, went to, I think it was a Pontiac dealer. Pontiac is no longer around, I think, but and he still had his uniform on. And he had a wad of cash in his pocket, and he saw a car on the showroom floor that he felt was perfect for my mom. And a salesman came over, and my father said, how much is that car? And the salesman told him, and my dad said, I think I'd like to buy that. And the salesman almost didn't believe him and started asking him some embarrassing questions. And my father dismissed them and said, go get your manager. He did. The manager came over. My father explained what he wanted to do. The manager said, let's sit down, fill out some paperwork. He bought the car, cash. It was done. But it all gets, and my father tells me this story because never judge a book by its cover.
Right.
You treat a man the way you want to, or a woman the way you want to be treated, regardless of what they look like. And it's one of those life lessons that you never forget. And you obviously still remember the story.
I remember the story. Yeah, it impacted me because I see you also live, people can talk about these things, but I see how you've always lived your life and continue to live your life based on the lesson. So I'd like to finish up by asking you, and again, this is whatever comes to mind, but if you had to think about a pivotal event, either professionally, personally, that influenced positively your career or your life, most memorable, does anything come to mind?
Yeah, I think on a very positive note, there was a time in my career where many companies were going public, selling their stock on the market, and I became pretty good at it. And I helped 3 or 4 different companies that were private companies go public, raise millions of dollars, and expand their business. And I took a lot of enjoyment from that. And I got very close to the principal owners in the company. And I think the joy I got out of that is that I was part of a team that helped create success, not only for the owners, but for the many employees and their families that depended on a livelihood. And now they were in a much more financially stable situation because of going public and raising all this capital to grow the business. The other part of it is that in that whole process, there were people who worked for me who I took a lot of pride in. I saw their growth. I saw their development. I tried to do the best I could to lead them, to teach them. And to this day, there's a number of folks who worked for me who have become extremely successful in running corporations or starting their own businesses or whatever. But, I take pride in that. It's almost like, you have a lot of pride in your kids. You invest a lot of yourself in your kids. And if you're lucky and things turn out well, you feel really good about that. And that's true in my case with my kids and with a number of the people who work for me.
Yeah, and I've heard from some of those people who credit you with a lot of responsibility for their success, and so that's something to be very proud of, and I'm always very proud when I hear that about you. So with that, I'd say, just to summarize, so when we talk about your outlook, the financial crisis you were faced with when Andersen went bankrupt, and all of these things and how you've dealt with it, I summarize it by saying, one is you're not someone who lives with envy, you're someone who lives to enjoy seeing other people succeed, particularly if you could have a hand in it, which is the opposite of how human nature often works. You also appeal mostly to your internal benchmarks. You want to do what's good for you and your family. You don't really care at all what other people might think about what you're doing relative to what they're doing, or what you have relative to what they have. And then the last thing I always say is, one of the things when I talk about money and happiness is there's an equation. It's what do I have in life, financially speaking, minus what I want. And if that equation doesn't lead to a positive number, there's a lot of unhappy billionaires, right? So you never move the goalposts like that. You kind of always, your wants weren't always based on materially having more than either you had today or than anybody else had. So I summarize with that because I think it's a great life lesson for those who are listening, for a practical outcome in life relative to the things I think are so important about money and happiness.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah.
We just recently moved uh, actually to an apartment, and there's no stairs, which are important to us as we grow older. And at this point in my life, I'm just it's not a mansion, it's not on 10 acres of land, but I feel so comfortable with where my wife and I are in life now, and how really happy we are.
Yep.
And I'm looking forward to the remaining years that the man upstairs wants to give us. And no regrets. No regrets.
No, that's terrific.
I've lived my life the way I hope a lot of people can live it.
No, well, you're a good example for a lot of people, and I call anti-human nature. You're the way you've lived your life. So thanks again for agreeing to be on the podcast today. It's great to have this conversation with you.
My pleasure.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of the Crazy Wealthy Podcast. Stay tuned to hear Amy's call-in for the recap of today's episode. Hello, everybody. This is Jonathan Blau, the host of Crazy Wealthy Podcast. At the end of the Fred Gold interview, I usually accept a phone call from my wife, Amy, but we decided today, since we're on our brief winter retreat in Boca Raton, Florida, we're going to have a conversation just in our morning walk.
Live from Boca.
Live from Boca.
It's Thursday Day Live.
So, Amy, what do you have for me?
Well, I want to know about how that conversation with my dad went.
I thought it went well. I thought that it's a unique interview for me, obviously, because, as you know, I lost my dad at 13, and he kind of became my dad. So in that way, it was very unique. But we also talked about some pain points in his financial life that most people not only couldn't talk about, but wouldn't want to talk about. But given his nature, temperament, and humility, he did a great job, was eager to talk about it, to kind of share some of the biases that led him to, unfortunately, fall into a bad financial position at was the end of his very successful career.
You know, what's so interesting to me is that, coming at it as someone who's seen this happen live, I saw the same thing happen with my grandfather. And he, unfortunately, had a terrible accident. He was a mechanic, and he lost the sight in one of his eyes. And at the age of 50, instead of staying on and working for many more years, he decided to sell his gas station and kind of hang it up. And that kind of led to a financial downfall for him that my father had to pick up the slack. And then I watched it happen to him also. So, I'm hoping I broke the curse. And having you as my advisor, I'm sure I have broken the curse. But what I learned about my dad is that he's the most resilient man I know. And I don't know if it all stemmed from his time in Vietnam, or if it stemmed from his time married to my mom. Or
well, from my perspective, nothing could lead to resiliency more than 50 years or more married to your mom, but that's a whole other story.
Or if it's, resiliency from having to raise my brother and I don't know, maybe just a combination of it.
What I can share with you is you didn't mention a word about resiliency being born out of his exposure to your mother for 50 plus years. So I'm going to share that with you now. What he did say is that one of his greatest teachers in life, because I asked him about how he was able to cope with these things, how he always, whenever I meet someone who knows him, who worked for him, or was a client of his, as I said, they call him the gold standard. He was the best. And I said, you always cared about others. He just has that temperament. But he also said, my greatest life lessons came from my dad. And he almost was tearing because, as you say, we call him Poppy. He was a mechanic, but your father didn't let him know he was running out of money. He just kept sending him money and telling him, no, Dad, you still have money, and they can't manage it. And that's the kind of person he is. But he also talked about his experience in Vietnam and how that also led to his resiliency. So all in all, his temperament, his selflessness, his ability to not want more and be envious of others, but rather want to help people and be happy for them as he helps them succeed. That's unique about him. And that all came through in the podcast.
One of the things that I know we talk about a lot is that money doesn't make you happy. It just makes life easier sometimes. But it will, if you're not a happy person, money won't make you happy, and it could make you unhappy at times. And that's one life lesson I've learned from my dad. He is no more or less happy than he was when he was making $1 million a year.
That's right. No, he's someone we talked about. So my recent podcast, I talked about internal and external benchmarks. So we want to show the world that we're staying in a fancy place. We stay at the Four Seasons in a one-bedroom with our family of four, even though our internal benchmark wants to be comfortable. It doesn't want to have the fancy place, but he doesn't succumb to the external benchmark. He always lives his life with the internal benchmark. So that was some of the examples in our recent Fix It Friday with Money Can't Buy Happiness. But to summarize what he illustrated through real-life experiences is familiarity bias, which leads you to make decisions to concentrate on things because you know them, even though the risk is the same as if you didn't know them. That caused them to make that decision at Andersen to leave his pension there. Regret aversion, which most people it get impacted negatively because in order to avoid the regretting something from an action they took, they just never take any actions. He didn't let that happen to him. So there's a lot of valuable information related to how we help people that came out in this podcast, and I enjoyed doing it.
So I'm going to end this by saying that when you said he's the gold standard as far as a accountant was, he is the gold standard as far as a man should be. And, I love having him as my dad. I'm so happy that you married into this family so that you can enjoy him also. And, buddy, if you don't start walking faster, I'm going to have to slow down, and that's not going to be good. So,
honey, you don't need to know that guy you just yelled at. What do you...
Everybody, if we don't hear from you or speak to you before the end of the new year, happy holidays, happy new year. We wish all the best for you and your family.
All right, until next time, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Crazy Wealthy Podcast. For more insights, resources, and to sign up for our newsletter, visit crazywealthypodcast.com. Until then, stay crazy wealthy.
The previous podcast by Fusion Family Wealth, LLC, Fusion, was intended for general information purposes only. No portion of the podcast serves as the receipt of or is a substitute for personalized investment advice from Fusion or any other investment professional of your choosing. Different types of investments involve varying degrees of risk, and it should not be assumed that future performance of any specific investment or investment strategy, or any non-investment related or planning services, discussion, or content will be profitable, be suitable for your portfolio or individual situation. Neither Fusion's investment advisor registration status, nor any amount of prior experience or success should be construed that a certain level of results or satisfaction will be achieved if Fusion is engaged or continues to be engaged to provide investment advisory services. Fusion is neither a law firm nor accounting firm, and no portion of its services should be construed as legal or accounting advice. No portion of the video content should be construed by a client or prospective client as a guarantee that he or she will experience a certain level of results if Fusion is engaged or continues to be engaged to provide investment advisory services. A copy of Fusion's current written disclosure brochure discussing our advisory services and fees is available upon request or at www.fusionfamilywealth.com.